The TFX Scale function found in the built-ins, the function plugins tab, and the text effects folder allows us to jitter the scale of a font. So we'll find a font and drag it down into the scene tree here. And let's just scale it up a little bit. We'll go back into our built-ins tab, drag the TFX Scale onto our font. Once we're in the editor, first thing that we have again is our progress percentage. We could set keyframes for this going from 0 to 100%. So I'll just change it to 100%, and once I do that, you can see how it starts to jitter the scale of this font. Now we have a progress type, so if we do have keyframes set, we can use the absolute or relative. Relative just means that we may need to increase the progress percentage depending on how many characters that we have for the keyframes to affect it. And if we do have keyframes set, we can choose how we want it to affect this. So we can start with normal, which is set by default. We can also go to opposite, random, static, wave, center, or to center. There's an interpolate setting, so the interpolate manages how you want the keyframes interpolated. When we do have a keyframe, we can set it to linear or soft. And again, with the keyframes set, we can choose the effect range and the random seed. The random seed works with the random setting up here in our direction type. There's an ignore space and ignore new line. They're on by default. This works with the relative setting, so depending how many characters we have on a line, how many spaces we have on a line, this ignore space and ignore new line will take into account the number of spaces and lines that we have. Now there is a text order which is set to as is by default. We can change this to horizontal. When we change it to horizontal, we can choose left to right or right to left. We have a vertical. When we change it to vertical, it gives us the text direction of up to down or down to up. There is an anchor horizontal set to center by default. When we change it to left, it anchors the text to the left. When we change it to the right, it anchors the text to the right. There's also an anchor vertical set to base by default. We can also change this to top. So when we change it to top, it now affects this font scaling from the top. We can also change it to center. It's affecting it from the center now. And the bottom, it affects it from the bottom up. There's a use axis, which is set to XY by default. We can change this to X. So when we change it to X, it only is affecting the X axis of the scale. There's also use axis Y. When we do that, it only affects the Y axis of the scale. And there's also a Z. When we change it to Z, not doing too much. Change it to XY, it's affecting the X and the Y scale of this. There's an X and Z, it's affecting the X and Z scale. And a YZ, now it's affecting the Y scale and the Z scale. And if we want to change it to all three, we can choose X, Y, and Z. We'll change it back to X, Y. There's a lock axis, which is on by default. With the lock axis on, we have a setting for minimum, which we can change from the minimum scale and a maximum scale. So if we want to make this bigger or scale bigger, we can increase the max scale of that. There's also a randomness. When we adjust the randomness, it kind of speeds up the scaling of this jitter effect. Now when we come back to lock axis and we turn this off, we get additional settings here. We have a minimum X, which we can adjust. We have a max X, so we can increase this, and when we do that, it increases the X scaling of this font. We also have a randomness again. We increase that. It increases the randomness scaling of the X variable. There's a minimum Y. We can adjust the minimum Y, the maximum Y, and a randomness set for this as well. Now, depending which lock axis we have or axis we're using, whenever we change this to a different setting on here, you see that it will automatically adjust to our settings down here. So if we change this to XYZ, now we have another option for the minimum Z, the max Z, and the randomness Z as well.